In this video, I'm going to be talking about exposure. So now that we understand what dynamic range is and how to measure it within your camera, as well as how to see if an image is overexposed or underexposed, I'm going to walk you through how to properly expose an image. And we're going to be working with the three main tools that you can use within your camera. I'm going to be walking you through shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. And more importantly, I'm going to show you how they all sync together so you can keep them in perfect balance to make sure your shots are exposed exactly how you want. So in order to effectively work with shutter speed, aperture, and ISO, we're going to be working within manual mode on the camera. And I know manual mode can seem intimidating, especially right off the bat in the beginning of this course, but my hope is to teach you how to use it early so that by the time you have been shooting for a couple months, couple weeks, whatever, it's essentially like second nature to you. I would say that I shoot about 95% of the time in manual mode, and the only times that I don't shoot in manual mode are when things are happening very quickly. So for example, if there are sports happening, which I don't shoot often, or if there's animals running, or if people are moving very quickly, for example, at a wrestling match, that's really the only time I'm going to use the other modes like shutter priority or aperture priority or even auto. But we're going to get into those a bit more in the additional settings video. For now, we're going to be working entirely in manual mode. So let's start from the top with the exposure triangle. So shutter speed is the first one that I want to walk us through because it's probably the easiest to understand. So shutter speed essentially controls the amount of motion blur within your camera. So the shutter is essentially the portion of the camera that opens up when you hit the shutter button, absorbs light, and then closes. So the shutter speed controls how long it opens and closes for. So for example, if you have a shutter speed that's 1/30th of a second, the shutter is going to open for 1/30th of a second, then close. This can go even more extreme, up to something like 1/8000th of a second if you have a fairly high-end camera, or you can keep your shutter open for an extremely long time. If you have an intervalometer, you can keep your shutter open for hours on end. I would say most people don't go above 30 seconds unless it's for a very special scene, but the point is you can keep your shutter open for essentially as long as you want. Now, why would you want to change your shutter speed? So for example, a shot that's shot at a high shutter speed, something like 1/2000th of a second, you'll be able to capture water in midair. So you'll be able to capture it completely frozen, which can add a cool effect to your shot. It's also great if you're shooting, like I said before, wrestling. So if someone's jumping off the ropes onto another person, you can capture them frozen in midair and they'll be perfectly crystal clear. Another reason you might want to work with your shutter speed is for long exposures. So if you're shooting waterfalls or the ocean or rivers and you want that nice silky smooth water, then you're going to want to keep your shutter open longer than 1/50th of a second, for example. And depending on how fast you want that water moving in your shot, you could keep it open for 1/10th of a second or even a few seconds. So let me show you a few more examples. So here's a shot that was taken at a high shutter speed. And here's another shot that was taken at a very high shutter speed. Now on the opposite side of the spectrum, here's a shot that was taken at a low shutter speed. And here's one more shot that was taken at a low shutter speed. So you can really see the blur in those images there. One more point I did want to make about shutter speed is that the amount of light coming in is important. So for example, if you're shooting at a very fast shutter speed, like 1/3000th of a second, then think about how much light's going to come in. It's going to be very fast. So it's going to open so fast and only let in a tiny bit of light. However, if you're shooting for 20 seconds straight with your shutter open, then it's going to bring in a lot of light. That's going to be important for later on in this video when I show how these are all balanced together. All right, so the second component of the exposure triangle is aperture. And aperture is probably the most confusing one just because it has a bunch of terms and weird abbreviations that you have to work with. Essentially, aperture is when you want to introduce depth of field into your shot. And depth of field is essentially focusing on a singular object and how much blur is behind it. I would say that's the easiest way to describe it. So something with a shallow depth of field would have one small part of the image that's in focus and the rest would be blurred out. A shot with a high depth of field would mean that a lot of the shot is in focus. So generally, aperture is measured in terms of f-stops within a lens. So you might remember this from the lenses video. So anything that's shot at f1.8, for example, is going to have a very shallow depth of field. Anything that's shot at f22, for example, which is extremely high, is going to have a very high depth of field and a lot is going to be in focus. If you were to look inside your lens, you would see that the little aperture ring, it's very small if you have a very high f-stop. So at f16, it's gonna be fairly small and it's not gonna let in a lot of light. On the opposite side, if you're shooting at f1.8, then the aperture is gonna be very big and it's going to bring in a lot more light. So let me show you a few examples. So here's an example of a shot that was taken at f1.8. You can see all the blur in the background of that shot and how it was able to achieve that very shallow depth of focus. And here's an example of an image that was shot at a high f-stop. So you can see how much of the image is in focus in this shot and there's not a lot that's really blurred out. Perhaps if you were to look into the smaller corners of the image, you might see something that's a little blurred, but it's not very noticeable. So that's essentially aperture. The third component of the exposure triangle is ISO. And ISO is essentially grain. So the lower the ISO, the less amount of grain in your image. And grain could also be known as noise. It's basically little specks that you'll begin to see in your image. And it's more prevalent in shots that are taken in a very low light setting. In terms of the general range that you want to shoot in with ISO, I would say ISO 100 is the most ideal. Some cameras can actually drop down to 50, but I would say you generally don't want to shoot above ISO 2000 to 3000. Up until then, it's fairly good. You'll have a little bit of grain in your shot, but it's not really going to be noticeable to the general public. Anything above that, it's most likely going to be noticeable, so keep that in mind. You generally want to shoot between ISO 100 and 2000 at the max. So, for example, here's a shot that was taken at ISO 100. And here's another shot that was taken at a fairly high ISO. Notice how you can see all the little grain in that shot and the face isn't completely crystal clear and it's just a little bit almost crackly. It's kind of got a film look to it. It kind of depends on your photography style as to whether you like grain or not. I would say for the most part in the contemporary landscape photography scene, grain isn't seen as a good thing. However, if you're trying to get moody shots, portraits, maybe you're trying to get some candid stuff out at a party, then grain could have a stylistic effect that you want to achieve. But for the most part, I'd say in the adventure photography world, you're going to want to minimize the amount of ISO and grain as possible. So ISO is really easy to control. You can basically just change the number within your camera. So you could be like, I want to set this at ISO 200, or I want to set this at ISO 10,000. It's literally just a setting. It's very easy to control, and it gives you the most amount of flexibility to work with aperture and shutter speed, as we're going to see in a second. The main thing to keep in mind with ISO is that the higher the ISO, the more light it's going to bring into the camera. So if you're shooting at ISO 2000, that's going to bring in a lot more light. All right, so now how do we combine all three of those together? And this is where it starts to get a little tricky and people begin to get confused. But it's actually very simple. So there's really just two questions that you want to ask yourself whenever you're taking a photo. So how much motion blur do I want in the photo? And how much depth of field do I want in the photo? And once you have that determined, you can adjust the other settings to ensure that your image is going to be exposed properly. For example, say you want more motion blur in your shot. Say you want a waterfall that's going to be a little bit silky smooth. So in order to achieve this, you would recognize that having your shutter open longer, aka getting more motion blur, is going to pull in more light into your camera. This means to compensate for that, you're most likely going to want to keep a low ISO because that's not going to bring in a lot of light. And you're also going to want to have a high f-stop or aperture because that's going to only bring in a little bit of light. If you remember from the aperture section, when you have a high f-stop, it's very small aperture ring. It's not going to bring in a lot of light. So that will allow you to balance your shot and get a proper exposure. On the other hand, say you want to work with a fast shutter speed. So you want no motion blur in your shot. You want for example, a water droplet frozen in midair. So in order to compensate for that, a high shutter speed isn't going to bring in a lot of light. So that means you're probably going to have a fairly low f-stop, so aka an aperture at like 1.8 or f4 or even 2.8 in order to bring in more light to help balance that image better. You can also add a bit more ISO into the shot to help add more light into it, but you're going to be at the risk of adding too much grain. So something to keep in mind. On the other hand, if you want to focus mainly on depth of field, so say you ask yourself, what kind of depth of field do I want in this shot? And say you're taking a portrait and you're like, I just want it to focus on her face. I only want blur in the background and I don't really care that much about the shutter speed because the model's gonna be sitting still anyways. So for this kind of shot, you would shoot, say, at f1.8. So you have her in focus, her face in focus, and to compensate for the fact that your aperture is very low and the ring is wide and it's bringing in a ton of light, that means you're probably gonna have to shoot with a faster shutter speed. So raising up your shutter speed is going to make it easy to achieve that, and you also want to shoot with a low ISO because that's gonna have less light, and this is gonna balance it out. So as you can see, all of these work together in order to achieve the perfect balance. And when you're shooting on your camera, if you're shooting with a mirrorless camera, for example, you could see and adjust these settings in real time and see in the viewfinder how it's affecting and how it's exposing your image. And if you have a histogram up and zebra stripes up as well, then it's almost guaranteed that you can get a great shot before you even snap the photo. You just have to practice with how these settings all work together. And that's really the key of all of this, is you want to become very fast at exposing a photo quickly in manual mode. And the only way to do this is practice. You just got to go out and just continuously shoot, try different situations, try adding motion blur, try taking it away, try adding depth of field, try taking it away, and just seeing how all three of these components work together. And once you get to the point where you can do that very quickly on your hand, in your camera, and it's essentially like second nature, this is when you're going to be able to get the crazy shots as they're happening very fast. There's nothing worse than being in the field, the light's hitting perfectly, and you're trying to figure out how to expose your camera quickly. You want this stuff to just be second nature. And I promise you that if you just keep working at it, it's gonna become so easy. For me, I could basically do it in my sleep. You know exactly where the buttons are and you just adjust perfectly and then boom, your shot's exposed easily. So that's the exposure triangle, that's manual mode. That is probably the biggest lesson in this entire course of how photography works. All right, so now that we've gone over that, let's go over a few special tricky situations. So there's gonna be times where something's peculiar in the scene and these images and this exposure triangle isn't gonna work out nearly as expected. So say for example, you're shooting a waterfall and it's fairly bright outside. So say you have a long exposure, say you're shooting at, let's say 1.5 seconds, and that's how long the shutter is gonna open. That's gonna bring in a decent amount of light to your camera. And if it's already bright outside, then shooting at a high f-stop or aperture, say at like f16 or something, isn't gonna be enough to darken up that scene, even if you pair it with a low ISO like 100. So the image is still gonna be blown out. So what do you do in this situation? And this is where you cut back to filters. So if you remember in the filter video, we talked about ND filters, which reduce the amount of light that's coming in. So this is where you can screw your variable ND filter onto your camera. It's gonna let less light in and you're going to be able to expose the image properly at that 1.5 second exposure time. So ND filters can come in clutch if you're shooting moving water in the middle of the day or even in fairly bright overcast weather. So the second situation is focus. So even if you're shooting at, say, a very high aperture, say you're shooting at like f16 or f22, And just for the record, I wouldn't recommend shooting at a high aperture like f/22. Anything above x/16 and you're gonna start to lose a significant amount of quality in your image. The edges are just gonna start to get softer and it's just not gonna look as sharp. The sharpest apertures are usually between f/8 and f/13 depending on the camera lens, so you're gonna wanna look that up. But anyway, back to the point. Say you're shooting at f/16 and there's still not enough within focus in the scene that you want to have crystal clear. Say you want the front of the foreground of the image to be in focus and you also want the background to get in focus. And shooting at f/16 just isn't cutting it. It's still blurry. So the way to mitigate this is a technique we call focus stacking. And essentially what focus stacking is you get about a middle range aperture set up. So say like f9, you get your camera on a tripod and you take 3 to 5 shots of the entire scene. Generally, you want to start at the very front or the bottom of your image. So take one shot of the front of the image focused, and then a little bit further away, and then a little further away, and then rinse and repeat until you get all the way to the back. Generally between 3 to 5 images, and you're gonna wanna take the majority of those images in the closer parts of the image. So now you have 3 to 5 images that are all different focuses. And what you can do is you can hop into Photoshop, align all these images together and blend the focuses. So that way the entire image will be in focus. And this is a way to beat the depth of field that comes from a single shot in a lens. And in the editing portion of the course, I'm going to show you exactly how to do this with a focus stack. So if you want to learn how to do that in the Photoshop realm, then go hop over to that video. So that's focus stacking. Another situation that might come up is the sky. So the sky is notorious for having a different exposure than the land in front of it, especially if it's a very bright day out. So say you're shooting a scene where the foreground is fairly dark and the sky is very bright. And no matter what you do to your camera in your exposure, you can't seem to get everything exposed together. The sky is either too blown out or the foreground is too dark. So one way to mitigate this is to take 2 photos. So you take one photo of the sky that's exposed properly, then you take another photo of the foreground that's exposed properly. And you want to do this on a tripod. You don't want to move the tripod around, you want to keep it in the exact same spot. And once you take these 2 photos, you can go into Photoshop and do an exposure blend where you can blend these 2 shots together so the image is entirely exposed properly together. And again, if you hop over to the editing portion of this course, there's an entire video on exposure blending where I'm going to teach you how to do this. Another application for this is, say you're at a waterfall and you're taking a long exposure. Say you're shooting at 1/10 of a second, the water coming down the falls. But the leaves are moving very fast. So all the leaves around the waterfall, it's a very windy day and they're all blowing back and forth. So when you take the shot of the long exposure, the water looks silky smooth and it looks perfect, except all the leaves are this blurry mess that you can't focus on. So what you can do is essentially called a time blend. And this is where you take another shot at a faster shutter speed of just the leaves. So that way you have a shot of the leaves frozen in time and then the silky smooth water. Then you could go into Photoshop and using a little bit of masking, you could blend these 2 images together so you have a perfect image. And again, I'm going to show you exactly how to do this technique in the exposure blending video in the editing portion of the course. But the point is, that's an example about how to mitigate scenes where the dynamic range is too much for your camera to handle. So that, my friends, is exposure in a nutshell. The main idea here is to practice, just get that exposure triangle like second nature. Don't use auto, don't use shutter priority, don't use aperture priority. Force yourself to use manual and learn how to use it, and your photography will get to the next level.